Recording in progress.
Good evening. This is everybody's welcome to the Chicago Computer Society's Linux SIG meeting for December 2024. Uh, Tonight we have not a lot of articles. I kept it down a little bit, but I just got something in the news this evening, and I hope that hmm, it shows up correctly. Wonder what the heck's causing that to appear. Hmm, Interesting.
I think it happened when Zoom announced that we're being recorded.
No, well, that actually comes up on a different screen. You
Then
gotta
it's the
remember, I
meeting
got multi
controls.
screens here.
Meeting controls, probably.
There went part of it,
Yep.
and there goes the other part.
There you go.
Well, no, I was trying to change it on the wrong screen. That's where the
Yep.
problem came in. But anyway, like I said, something just came up tonight, and I just got my hands on it just a short time ago. Hmm, Interesting. That didn't open up. That's unusual. Wonder why. No, that's not the one I want. Oh, you rotten son of a gun. Okay, I'm having issues that I didn't anticipate. That's the one I want. Okay. This is an article I got between 5 and 5:30 this evening, our time. U.S. is investigating potential national security risks posed by internet routers used by millions. These specific ones that they're looking into are TP-Link. Now, how they isolated it down to the one manufacturer, I'm not exactly sure. But when you consider, I think it's Huawei or something like that, they were into cell phones and telecommunications, even here in the United States, had a lot of their equipment that was deemed to be removed by the government because of security uh, issues they believed might exist. That's what this is too. Is that okay? TP-Link tend to be somewhat of a cheap router, and they think maybe there's a risk there, so they're going to start investigating it to see if it indeed is a security risk. Anybody got any comments on that news item?
I got this through the Yahoo news feed, which was the same story. I First of all, let's be clear about something. In spite of people saying it's a Chinese company, it's not. The company is Singapore based and US based, has been for years. However, these routers are made in China, and it is thought by some in the government that the Chinese may have monkeyed with them. I the main these kinds of risks you can't do anything about with a firmware upgrade, and you can't do anything about it by changing passwords or administrator passwords, because if it's in there, it's a backdoor that's built into the router, similar to the problems there are in some IoT devices.
Well, it'll be interesting. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court says about TikTok in a couple weeks here.
We don't know exactly when that'll be, but they are looking at it in the Supreme Court. But they're trying to claim that their First Amendment rights being violated, and the Supreme Court's got to try and decide, does national security and really as a social media, our youth in jeopardy that trumps the First Amendment in this instance? We have to all wait and see.
Mm-hmm.
Now, aside from this news item, does anybody have any problems, other news items they want to bring up, opinions, etc.?
I just want to add that the type of issue they think they have in these routers is very similar to what they did demonstrate was going on with Kaspersky security. That type of backdoor spying.
It's possible. I mean,
So again, this is not something we ourselves as consumers would be able to do anything about, but we're not the main targets of it.
right. No, we're not the main targets, but they're trying to find out, is there a security problem? But some, not all, CPUs, GPUs, I don't know about the NPUs for sure, they may be packaged in some cases in China. I think all the manufacturing is done here, in at least in most instances, but that doesn't mean that they in the packaging couldn't include additional circuitry that is not authorized, I guess is the best way to phrase it.
Yeah, I mean, look what happened to the 3,000 pagers that exploded. So, boy, you never know.
Whatever. All right. One thing I brought up last month was about the NASA's and servers and stuff, and I said it's a complex subject. I only know a little bit about it, so it's something that I am learning as I go along. I haven't got it totally set up, but I have here, as you can see, I am talking to one of my machines here. The machine only has the power adapter and an Ethernet cable, no monitor, no keyboard, no mouse. And I can do it from the browser. I can also do a remote SSH link through the terminal. And it doesn't care what OS you got. So you can be on Windows, Mac, you can be on any Linux. Right now, this is a Linux that I'm launching this from, and I've been doing it from my, whoops, wrong keyboard. That's the problem here. Now, there's nothing secure here because I have done nothing with security on this system as yet. I'm using the default password, which is Open Media Vault. And we'll get rid of that. And this is what's called a dashboard. And originally, it doesn't come up. You have to know what to click on, and then you can select a large category of different trying to remember where it's at too. Here we go, dashboard. These are all the possibilities, so I checked everything off. So that's why you see everything. And I'm going to go back, I hope, to the dashboard. And it gives me a CPU activity, utilization. This happens to be an i5, but on a 35 watt. So it's a little more powerful than Bob Premick's Nux machines, which is 15 watts tops. This is 35. And I do have some that are 65 watt. But it does a pretty good job, so I'm happy with it. SSH is active, enabled, and I have used it. And I have different logins for SSH versus through the browser. Now, it also gives me temperatures. And one thing you'll note here, there are two devices. One here is, this is an NVMe. It's sitting under a caddy with a 2.5-inch SATA drive, and the biggest one I've got is in here, 512 gigabytes, excuse me. And so it's sitting on top. It's got a nice temperature, but there's no extra fan in this model of mini computer that I've got. Newer generations that I do have usually have a fan for cooling the NVMe motherboard storage devices. I might be able to get a fan for this one too to cool it down, but I've also got something in tonight's presentation that looks interesting. It'll probably cost more than I want to pay, but we'll find out. Right now I'm only using 1% of the file system. It's used 2 megabytes on this 512 formatted drive. I have Ethernet set up. This is Wi-Fi. It is available in the unit, but unless you're really stuck, normally you would not have it in the unit. It's not needed. You would normally take this computer and you would take and have it hooked up next to your router. And the reason you would have that is the router has all the Wi-Fi built into it. So if I take a laptop like this, I can open up my vault here, open media vault, and it's not connected by anything other than Wi-Fi. And it goes to the router routes it to this device and connects it via Ethernet. So it gives you a stronger, more stable signal for the most part, though that's beginning to change with some of the newer Wi-Fi. The question becomes saturation and other causes of interference to radio waves that are used by Wi-Fi. The more interference or congestion in your area, the more problems you might have with using a Wi-Fi interface. It says I have an update available. This is more information about the system itself, uh, what time it is, and also it's been up. I restarted it early today, so it's only been up a short time. This is the smart status of both storage devices. So there's that. If I come to System and I come down to Update Management, click on Updates, I have this update here. And this is how you get them automatically in for notification, but they do not install by themselves. So I'm going to take a chance here. I got to confirm. I want to update, say yes, and it shows you what it's doing, and it's still going through it. And not everything is set up on this yet. I am looking at having auto shutdown at a time of day and auto startup the next day. I also have information on how to conserve some additional energy, electricity, while you have it running. When it says end of line, the installation is done, and it wants to a confirmation here of pending changes. So I will put check mark and say yes, and it will configure all the updates that has there. It right now has nothing on the storage device, realistically speaking, because I haven't gotten that far yet. Back under System, you have your date and time, notifications, power management. You can schedule tasks, and you also have monitoring, scheduling general tasks. This is where I've got to put in for having it shut down, and tell it also when I want it to start back up. But there's 4 or 5 gotchas. It has to do with the machine. If you have, like Dennis has, unless he got rid of them, some real old machines, so do I, the power supply was APM, not the current ACPI standard. And you cannot usually turn it off. There's at least one other setting that you cannot you cannot use unless you've got true ACPI compliance in the system. But you can do memory as an example, and it will give you an effective 90% reduction in your power usage while the system is alive. So that at least helps. And there's a couple other settings that can be taken care of. Now, this unit does not have Type A 3.2 USB Gen 2, which has a 10 gigabit transfer instead of 5. It doesn't have a USB-C 20 or 40 gigabyte Thunderbolt connection, or the USB 3.2 NVM, the Gen 2 type of speed of 10 gigabits on a C connection. But you can hook up external drives, and I know of a change that can be done to try and spin them down when they're not needed, which saves some power as well if you want to. But this device internally can only handle 2 devices. Uh, then certificates. I haven't gotten to this yet, but right now I should create a SSH and an SSL certificate. They're for my local operation because right now this is treated as an HTTP connection through the browser. If I create the SSL certificate, it then would become an HTTPS connection. And for SSH, I would be able to encrypt my SSH remote connection. And if this device was outside the house, outside my network, I definitely would want to have that capability set up. So I've got that. And it gives you storage information. It gives you network interfaces. It does have a firewall. It's not turned on. It's an IP table type one, and I played with IP table some years back, and I find it a little bit too annoying. But I may have 2 other possibilities that can be done to give an easier version of firewall. Then you have services, and in some instances, if you've got a Windows machine that wants to communicate with this, sometimes the SMB slash CFS will work without having a Samba server set up. But you can get a Samba server added to this if it's needed. And then you have, of course, the SSH service. You got users. Right now I have only the default admin account. You can't see it directly. You have to see it indirectly. So I can go here and I can change the default password, which of course is recommended. But since I'm still playing with this in a learning mode, I don't care. This whole setup may be just very temporary. I don't know how long I'll have it. I have some other things that I want to do, and I'll just wait and see how I work with it. And then you have some diagnostics that you can run in case you start running into some issues. So does anybody have any questions I might be able to answer right now? I do know that Open Media Vault has a lot of applications that can be added. Whereas some other things that I talked about last month briefly may not always have a lot of things. There's also Casa OS that I'm going to be looking at. That's the one that only has really 2, but you can add Open Media Vault to it, and it has a lot of interfaces. But right now, Casa OS only has 2 that you can add directly to Casa OS. There's also now a Hex OS in beta, but that's going to cost money. And for the sophisticated people, you have Unraid that I didn't report last time. That costs money. And so I don't know how many people will want to look at Hex OS or Unraid, but the rest of them are all viable, and there are free versions to run. Anybody got any questions, comments?
Yeah, Tim.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is free.
I didn't
And
pay anything for it.
so You download it and you install it like Linux,
Yeah.
so it takes over the machine
Yes.
that you're installing.
Yes. That is
Oh,
correct.
okay.
Basically speaking, you download Open Media Vault. It's an ISO. You can use Balena Etcher or you can use Rufus to put it on a flash drive that has to be, I think you can get by with a 4, but I think it recommends at least an 8. I used an 8. And when you boot up off of that, anything that's out on the drive that you say, put this on, which was for me the NVMe, it'll wipe out whatever's there and put its own stuff in. Just like any other Linux distribution will also do.
Okay.
Now, from that standpoint, it is pretty good in that one respect. Cassia OS, which I'm going to be looking at too, I cannot find a ISO image to do the installation. In fact, it seems to be, and I'm also bringing it up here, to do Cassia OS, you have to load in something like Debian Desktop Minimal, because there's no applications with that version. You just get the desktop, which you are not going to need or use. And then you install Cassia OS on top of that through a script you run in the terminal, which is the only application you get in the minimalist version. You can also use Ubuntu, and that both of those have a server version you can probably also use, as long as you can run this script from a terminal. But once you get these things set up, well, when you first try and set this up on a machine, you got to have a monitor, keyboard, and a mouse. The mouse may be superfluous. It depends upon how you do things in Linux even. A lot of it can be done strictly by the keyboard, and you got to have the monitor to look at it. Once it's set up and running, you will see on a restart about 3.5, 4 inches of text on a black screen. And it's just going to sit there unless you log in there, which you can do. It uses the same login as SSH from another computer. But barring that, you can immediately take out the plug for the monitor, the keyboard, and the mouse. And that's it. If you use an old system that still uses a PS2 mouse and keyboard, you can pull them out. Do not plug them back in unless the system is shut off. And you can do that through the SSH or through this web dashboard. You can shut it down. So I can come over here. This is a power button. I can reboot the server right now. I can do a standby mode. I haven't figured out how to end the standby mode yet, so I have tried it once. And here's a shutdown, and it'll turn it physically off. Also, you can shut off by, like I said, a timed event. I can say at 11 p.m., turn this server off and have it start up tomorrow morning, whatever time I want. And it'll do I know because I was able to test out to make sure that it was a ACPI compliant computer. And you do that by just opening up a terminal, putting in the command, and if it turns off and turns back on, you're cool. Also, since right now I have solid state, no spinning drives, I could use a short period of time for the restart test. But if you have spinning drives, you might want to give it more time to make sure that all the spinning drives shut down properly. So that's one thing I am aware of. Anybody got any other questions or comments?
Yeah.
What
Work across the internet.
A proxy internet option is it's supposed to hide you kind of like a VPN for servers, but in reality, it's almost useless. And there may be another purpose to it, but I'm not that in depth on proxy servers. Generally speaking, if say for example you set Peter one of these up in your work environment or in your home, either one, and you were at the school you're teaching the kids after school, you could SSH into your system and it will be encrypted from that terminal you use to the Open Media Vault if you set the SSH up correctly.
Okay, so there's a possibility that I can leave it at work running and get all the files from the house.
Yes, and you can do it from the
Okay.
house. So it's up to you. You can also probably put a VPN on if you want to. That does a little better job of masking your real address, IP address, but there are ways now, a lot of the high-end criminals know how to get enough information as to who you are and what your IP address may really be. And this is because of foreign government sponsorship.
Yeah. I'm looking at the site on the other machine right now.
That's fine.
I know that's fine. I'm just letting you know that.
I've got a whole bunch of stuff. I haven't been able to get to this much for several days. I got all this stuff that I've got and showed you so far briefly done 2 days or 3 days last week before I had to stop and work on Tuesday's meeting and today's meeting.
what put you onto this or made you look at this particular thing, Tim?
Well, I've been wanting NAS and stuff for a long time. I started setting up a purchase NAS. Now, if you go out Amazon or you go out to eBay and you put in for just NASs, and the prices that'll come back will be anywhere between $500 and $1,000. And that usually does not include drives. Drives are extra. What you're getting is the box, the rack that holds the drives that's usually hot swappable, and then you also have a microcomputer board with their software on it, and you have to configure it in many ways, like you have to do this one here or TrueNAS. And it's for, shall we say, bulk backup. It's for backing, for storage of files and media that you want to share with multiple computers, such as Dennis, you got a wife. She may be on her laptop right now. I don't know. And what you would do is she would be linked into that server, the NAS server, and be able to, if you got movies on there, she could watch the movies you have recorded. You can also have documents, especially like tax documents, that you might also want to have independently encrypted. And three would be music files. You can play your music anywhere you got a computer terminal in your house. You can also do this remotely. And one interesting thing that I haven't yet found somebody who successfully did it, but I'll bring it up anyhow, is let's say, for example, I created this NAS here. Let's say that I finish it off, get it fully functional the way I want it. And then I would give it to, say, Earl McCoy. And every time I wanted to do my NAS to do backup and get the documents that's stored on this thing, I would connect to his place on my device. And he might have a similar device at my house, and he would do the same thing. So basically speaking, this is acting like a cloud. Drew King has a subscription to Real Cloud Storage. So he does a lot of his stuff to that cloud storage. He has to pay a fee for to use. This one, it's whatever my equipment costs me. It's offsite, say at Earl's, and Earl's is at mine, and whatever he had to pay for his. And we can have offsite cloud type of communications with our devices. So it's this is something that a lot of people do use, not everybody. Right now, I've got a fair-sized little box full of USB drives. Most of them are 1 terabyte, and a couple of them are 2 terabyte in size. And I've been using that for all my machines when I do a backup. Well, right now, I can change that once I've got the rest of this finished here and do my backup through, have the file of the backup go through the internet to that machine, and it's stored there. When I need to recover, I connect to that server and pull the image off and reload it. So it's a way of getting it done, and I may be able to eliminate a box full of external terabyte drives and have its own. Now, mind you, I've only got a 512 gigabyte hard drive in there. I could still do some backups, not many. So understand that factor. It depends upon each machine that I do, whether it's Windows, it could be a Mac, it can be Linux. Depending on how much is out on each machine will determine the size of the backups and how many you might be able to fit on a 512 gigabyte drive. The more normal would be to have at least probably 4 terabytes on up to as much as you want to pay for. And most of the time it's on spinning hard drives. And the spinning hard drives, the main reason for that is cost. It's spinning hard drives relatively speaking, are dirt cheap compared to trying to do the same ideology using SSDs. SSDs will cost you a fortune. And you can set up your storage with RAID. This is with one drive. You can't realistically set it up as RAID. So that's out of the question as far as that goes. But it's a good test bed. And what I'm thinking of using this one for is to eliminate a lot of my flash drives that I've got. Because I have a lot of different things on a lot of different flash drives. I'll consolidate it into one machine, and I just have to connect each individual machine to this server and get whatever files are put on the server downloaded, if necessary, to each individual machine. And Casa OS is just a plain server to which you can add a NAS to it as one of the applications. And that could be Open Media Vault, or it could be a true NAS. Does that answer your question? I hope.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Anybody got anything else? Okay. I'll consider that closed. Come on. Oops. Wrong keyboard and mouse. I keep grabbing for the wrong one. Okay. Easy Linux privilege escalation. This is something that you might run into a need for from time to time, and that's the only reason I spotted it and decided to put it in. Most of the time, what we're doing doesn't require us to escalate, except when we're in a terminal where we have to do a sudo or a sudo space -i or sudo su command to go into the root administrator of the Linux operating system. And then you can do some other things there. Most of the time that you would need this here might be in a situation where you cannot get to a terminal. Perhaps you've got a restricted user on the system, and you may have to have this as a way of being able to escalate your own privileges to do an administrator's function without going back to your machine or to some other machine to change permissions.
If you're hacking a Linux server and have gotten a foothold on a machine, one of the next steps to do is look for ways to escalate privileges. The goal in almost any engagement is to be able to take over the root user so that we have full control over the Linux device. Today, we're diving into one of the most helpful resources in the world of Linux privilege escalation, GTFO bins. GTFO bins is a curated list of Unix binaries that can be used to bypass local security restrictions in misconfigured systems. One of its most common uses is checking if any of the binaries can be run with sudo or suid permissions in order to upgrade our privileges to the root user. GTFO bins has a list of over 375 binaries that when our user is given sudo privileges over, can be abused to gain a shell as root. So we're basically abusing a normal, legitimate executable such as Python that we have been given the ability to run with sudo in order to become root. Let's dive a little deeper into this Python example. If we filter GTFO bins by binaries that can be exploited with sudo rights by clicking...
Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. He's taking it from the standpoint of a hacker outside of your own facilities trying to gain access. The only way I look at it is maybe I forgot all the passwords or something else is causing a problem and I need to get in to get control. This is a possible way of getting a control. But it also exposes your system and how other people, if you're not careful, can overtake even your Linux machines. And I've seen it happen once. Somebody else that was trying to was having problems with a hacked system. It was a Windows system. They ended up with I gave them a temporary Linux setup on a machine, and they hacked that too. And so whoever they were, these were top-end hackers that you're not going to keep out of a system without having some real tight guidelines on how the security is set up to try and prevent that from occurring. And there are a number of different ways of doing that. There is no one silver bullet, I guess is the best way that I can think of stating it. Anybody got any question or issue on this? Hearing none, I'll go to the next one. I'm saving Earl's thing for last. Okay, now this is a cool item. I want one of these, but I have a feeling that when they become available, they're going to cost too much. But you got to see this thing.
What if I told you that this device here, this tiny piece of metal with no moving parts, could produce an air current silently, and it's a strong enough current to cool a laptop? You would think it was impossible, right? You'd be like, this, it doesn't exist. There's no way. Okay, let me do a quick demonstration. So this technology is inside this little box here. It's right in this section here. I'm going to lay down some smoke, and you will see it's crazy, and it's silent, like no sound. And the best part about this whole technology, I saw a fully functional laptop with this inside it. It was running off of this cooling technology, and this device was built by a very big company, very well-known company. They're going to be showcasing at CES in a couple weeks. So this technology comes from a company called Ventiva. They've made a solid-state cooler that is unlike anything I've seen before. But to appreciate what's really going on here, we got to go back in time a little bit. 2 years ago, there was a product that made headlines. It was a product from a company called Frore, and they made something called the Airjet. And I chose not to cover their tech. Let me explain why. The Airjet used a technology that was like basically vibrating material. So they would take these piezoelectric membranes and they would flap them very quickly, 24,000 times a second. And when you vibrate them like that, you're able to create an air current. Now, the technology, very neat. And I did a demo with it, I was briefed on it, and I never made a video on it because there was one huge problem. That technology, at least at the time, was very energy inefficient. So just some numbers. A typical laptop fan, something like this uses 1 watt of energy to produce about 1.3 to maybe 1.5 CFM. Obviously, it varies based on design and whatever, but around that, right? 1.3 to 1.5 for 1 watt of energy. The Frore, the Airjet, used 1 watt of energy for 0.2 CFM. Very little airflow for that type of energy. So if you're using it for laptops, I mean, that was the goal, right? That was the dream, to be able to use something like that. It just didn't make sense. And when I looked at the numbers, I'm like, there's no way this is ever going to be picked up by a laptop company anytime soon. And 2 years later, we still do not have any laptop companies that have touched it because energy efficiency. Also, there's issues with like vibrations and stuff when you're flapping things at that kind of rate. There is one product that uses it. It's a desktop with unlimited power because that plugs right up to the wall. But the whole idea of energy efficiency does not work well with that Airjet product. Okay, now, since that thing was announced, I've been approached by multiple companies saying they have, we got some new solid state cooler. They've all been that type of tech. So I've kind of been jaded to this whole idea of a solid state cooled laptop. And then 2 weeks ago, I hear about there's this new product being demoed at CES that uses a different kind of technology. And apparently there was like a laptop being built with it. So I'm like, okay, let me see this. I go to the website, and it is in fact an entirely different method of cooling. It's actually solid state, there's no moving parts, and it works through the ionization of air molecules. So they have these harmonica looking things, they call them their ionic cooling engine, and inside each one of these they have a wire and a grill, and these act as two electrodes. So when you run a high enough voltage through that wire, it ionizes the air around it. So stuff that we breathe, like oxygen, nitrogen, those are now ionized. They are missing an electron. And now those ionized molecules are very reactive. They're trying to replace that missing electron. So they're attracted to the negatively charged grill. So you got these ionized air molecules that jump over to that grill. And the act of that jumping creates a little bit of wind. But then you multiply it by billions and trillions of air molecules that are just doing this at the same time. Now you have some real airflow. It's a very crude representation of what's going on here, but that's essentially what it is. You have air molecules that are being ionized and then immediately deionized, and that process creates airflow. It's crazy, but it works. So I'm looking through their press material, it all seems very impressive, and I reach out to them, I'm like, can you show this thing to me? Do you guys have like functional things that I can see? And they come up and they show me a functional laptop. The company that built this, laptop, everyone knows this company. It's a very well-known company. You'll see it at CS. I wish I could show it to you, but it's not time yet. But the technology behind it was crazy. I was running Prime 95 and looking at hardware info, completely normal clock speeds. It's a powerful chip, and there's no sound. There's no moving parts. It's wild. Like, think about it for a second. You're creating wind. You're creating airflow from nothing. It's like a piece of metal, and it's like there's airflow coming out of it. It's crazy. It's so freaking crazy. The more I talk about this, I'm vocalizing my thoughts. I'm like, this is nuts. This is like, in my mind, this is like game-changing technology that fundamentally changes what laptops can and I think should be. And in addition to showing me that working laptop, they also demonstrated the airflow using a more elegant device than the one that I showed earlier. Now, keep in mind that using a smoke machine like this is visually exaggerative because smoke particles follow fluid dynamics. Like when you look at that video, it might seem like it's hairdryer airflow. It's not. It's much more modest than that, but it's a lot more airflow than the airjet and much more energy efficient at doing it. So like I said, a regular laptop fan moves around 1.5 CFM per watt. The airjet from Frore, their product does 0.21 CFM per watt. Ventiva's Ionic Tech does around 1 CFM per watt. So it's not as energy efficient as a regular laptop fan, but it's essentially silent and it's small. So this is the size of a typical laptop fan, and the larger you go, the quieter you can run it. But the reason why size is so important when it comes to fans and stuff is that these things dictate how you design laptops. Like, because these things have to be in there to cool them for most laptops, you have to take that into consideration when you figure out like how big of a battery is it, how big is the whole product. Like the whole thing revolves around thermal design, right? And that's how big they often are. Now, the Frore Airjet was quite a bit smaller, and because it was so small, I think that's why it was so exciting to a lot of people, because it's like, if you can shrink it down to this size, that changes things. But energy efficiency problems. Now, the tech from Ventiva is different. They can make them in custom lengths and stuff, but these little metal components are not enough. You need a couple other things. First, you need some kind of housing. Like in this example here, this is actually housing the middle-sized one that you saw previously, and this was the thing that was inside the machine that I showed you earlier. But this little housing serves two purposes. One, it serves to kind of direct the airflow as it generates it, but also it acts as like a kind of a small Faraday cage, because that electrode wire generates an electromagnetic field that you have to contain using a Faraday cage type product like this. But in addition to the housing, you also need to have a power supply. So in order to operate this thing, you need to be able to generate a high enough voltage, very low current, but a high voltage to be able to create the ionization capabilities of that wire. And this is it here. Now this is an older generation of this thing. They're actively shrinking down more and more, and supposedly have several in development that are significantly smaller than this, but each one of these power supplies can operate several of those harmonica looking things. These little what they call them ionic cooling engines. And I think this one in particular can do 3, but they have other ones that can do more, like 5 and 6, whatever. But the idea is that you need one of these for several of these cooling things that you can place around the laptop. But as you shrink that, the whole thermal solution becomes smaller and smaller. And even in its current state, like this like older generation what I have in front of me right here, this is already smaller than most fans. Now there are 3 kind of obstacles that I think this product has right now. So the first one is the cost. So a typical laptop fan is so cheap. Like these are $1 to $3 or $4. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like single digit dollars. So even the most custom solutions out there with like finely tuned fins and stuff, like these are very inexpensive. A new solution like this, like out of the gate with low volume, I wouldn't be surprised if this is like an extra $40 or $50 cost for the manufacturers. It's a lot more than fans. So I feel like when that pricing trickles down to consumers, it's going to be a decent step up. This is like based on very little laptop engineering knowledge, but that's just my thinking. But the other thing is ozone. So when you ionize air, especially with oxygen molecules in our atmosphere, you have the potential to create ozone, like O3. Now, I spoke to them about this because right when they demoed this, I was like, wait, you're ionizing air? Isn't there O3? And so they have a solution. They say that they're using manganese dioxide as a catalyst on the copper, or like I guess on the heatsink or the fin area, and it just acts as a catalyst to facilitate the conversion of that ozone back to oxygen immediately. Now, they've supposedly done some testing with like UL standards, and apparently it's all good up on the up and up. And now that I'm saying this out loud, I do think that in order for that company to have picked this thing up and make a laptop with this, it probably passed all the certification. But it's just a thought that I had. And I also did ask them like dust and all that stuff. And they apparently have solutions for all these things. It's just all under patents. They didn't explain the details of it. But a lot of that is solved. But the third, and I think the biggest obstacle with this, it comes down to static pressure. So static pressure is, I guess it's the ability for a fan to continue pushing air even if there's resistance. So a typical laptop fan, these things have like, I'd say like 40 to maybe 50 pascals of static pressure. So that's like the higher the better, because that means that you can push the air through a lot of heat like fins. You can suck air through a lot of like tiny holes. This is okay. The Furore AirJet product, one of its main strengths was very high static pressure. I think that was like 1700, way above. So that had the ability to like suck air from really far away, not particularly energy efficiently, but it could do it. This product here, the Ventiva, has a static pressure rating of 12. So significantly lower than like the 40 or 50 of a laptop fan. And because of that, there's one limitation to this. One big limitation to this. So if you'll notice from the demo unit earlier, the air intake holes are really close to the ionic cooling engine itself. And they've done that just to minimize the amount of resistance that the air is going to get to be able to flow in through that device and out. And the reason why this whole idea of like static pressure is an issue is that when it comes to the typical laptop design right now, like this is an Asus product. So this right here, this is air intake, and it sucks air in through here and then out the back of the device, the exhaust. But this like main intake grill area is not the only area that air flows through this system. Like obviously the main intake is here, but even like the device itself, when you pop it open, there are little gaps all across the keyboard, and airflow goes to the keyboard. And even up top, there's like this is stylistically designed, but there's air that's going through these little grills that get exhausted out the back. But the reason why this device is able to suck air from all those little tiny holes is because the static pressure of those two fans is reasonably high. Now, there are even devices out there, like laptops, where they'll actually seal off the intake here because they want air to flow in a very particular way through like other sources. And that's just the way that laptops are designed. You're getting that air to flow across multiple components before it gets exhausted. But because the static pressure of this device is so low, you lose that capability. You don't have the ability to like suck air from really far, small holes all across the laptop before it goes in through the ionic mechanism. And because of that, I think that if you just build a laptop using this technology with no change to the components and where things are placed, you lose a lot of the efficiency. In order to take real advantage of this, you need to just redesign a laptop completely with components moved into different areas so that you don't need to rely on strong static pressure to be able to just make proper use of this type of cooling technology. And I think that's why a lot of their press material shows coolers on different edges of the laptop. But I look at this tech and I'm just super excited to see what other companies do with this technology. Like I think if I had to bet, I feel like this changes the trajectory of laptops. I really think that this type of tech is, like, it feels tangible. It's real. Like, it already is tangible. I saw one, but it just feels proper. It doesn't feel like vaporware. Like, I'm not saying that Furore was vaporware. I feel like they had good intentions, but just like the technology and the physics behind it, you hit a wall. Like, energy you can't beat physics. But here, the physics, they already work. So, all right, there you have it. I hope you guys look at this and don't think I'm crazy. Like, I'm so excited by this. I hope you guys are as well.
Okay, any comments?
Yeah, it sounds like the 70s air cleaners that I used to have on my furnaces and in my house.
I've got one of those too.
Yeah, it seems that this is an expensive solution to a problem that not many laptops will have unless they are ultra thin and have really powerful or fast internal components.
Agreed.
And people who buy those kinds of laptops probably are willing to pay the price.
Well, I think it's also too a case where might this not today, not tomorrow, but some tomorrow may obsolete those flimsy little fans, because I had that neighbor with a Nux, and it uses a fan very much like what you saw there in the video. And bottom line is, it died. It wouldn't work anymore. So you had to get a new fan. And that cost, he was lucky, I think I got it for around $18 and a little bit for the shipping plus tax. So the price wasn't too bad. But that thing has no moving parts, so it doesn't wear out. It will last as long as the whole unit exists.
Yeah, well, actually, it will wear out. But the thing is, it's quiet. That means it will be a lot better for meetings than my Nuck, which makes a lot of fan noise.
Okay.
It's got a nice adequate fan, very robust fan, but the fan is the size of the unit. It's 4x4.
Okay.
And when you're talking about a fan whose diameter is closing in on 4 inches, you're talking about a lot of noise when it revs.
Sure.
At when it goes to high revolutions. And this thing would be quiet, and it would be smaller.
Yes, and on at least some of the Nuxes, you have side vents besides the back vents. You have the cracks like he was talking about for the keyboard, etc. So you're pulling air in. You might end up with having 3 of these things. I don't know. That's a guess. But
Well, I don't know. I've been reading it, the main use they want to make of it is in ultra thins.
yes,
And those have absolutely no place for air to come in and out.
that's right.
So these guys, this device is absolutely necessary.
Yes, but I'll bet you they'll migrate eventually to the bigger ones. What the heck happened?
I'm just hoping that they're using them in a clean environment. Otherwise, they're going to be plugged up real fast.
You know,
there should be some way to access them for cleaning when needed.
Well, I'm sure you can do that. I mean, you can do that now even with a spinning fan. Generally speaking, you in the vent areas with the computer shut off, you use canned air with a nozzle, and that should blow out most of the dirt and dust that might accumulate. If you got animals like me, that's a slightly different story there. Now it depends upon the grill work as to whether it can stop the animal hair versus airflow that could contain dust. And you shouldn't have to
I
open
know
it
it.
up. Pardon?
I know, or I have a high feeling that it would not work here on the islands or in a salt environment where there's salt spray, because that gets everywhere. Here we have not only the salt spray, but we also have the iron from the lava that's in the air. Everything goes to red real fast and very hard to get out.
That could be.
So it's got to be for clean room work.
Yeah, it sounds like for that, you got to be able to take your equipment apart and do a thorough cleaning probably a couple times a year.
Yeah, yeah. With solvents.
Okay. Next up. Now this one here I stumbled across too, and it's a printing system with a driver for Linux, it says here. Well, they also make a version for the Windows and Mac also. I've got a second tab here for that that I can show you. But even here, I can hover over downloads, and I can get Linux, Mac OS 10, Windows, and some kind of a color profile. I'm not sure what the hell that's about, but I didn't get deep into it. At least for me, I don't use printers as much as I used to, and even then, I don't know that I would need what this product can offer, and I do believe it costs money. But it gives, in some cases, a print driver with a high speed that can also handle double-sided printing if that printer has that capability. And sometimes, especially if it's an older printer that can handle two-sided, you might not be able to get the driver for that particular printer to do double-sided printing. This might solve that issue because it's more modern. So it's something that I figure a person here and there might be interested in it, especially if you're a person like Burt Good or Jim Freeberg. They do taxes, and therefore they may have to print out a lot of stuff for taxes. While I was a tech for Dell, I had to go to the downtown offices of Deloitte and Touche, accounting firm, and they got printers and terminals all over the friggin' place, and they really print tons and tons of paper. They could probably very much use something like this if they can do their taxes via a server program and they terminal into it, say from a Linux system, or if it works well with the Windows and or Mac OS. Sometimes The Linux software works better on the Linux system and not quite as good or as well on the other platforms. You got still a possibility that you can improve your performance even for a person. Sometimes I go into in the past years to say Walmart, and there's usually somebody sitting up front by where the cashiers are that is there about taxes and trying to get clients. He's got a laptop, and I don't know if he had a printer or not, but in either case, he has to print those out at some point in time, most likely, unless the person who is the client has their own printer at home, and he just sends them the finalized version, and they print it out on their own printer. I don't think he has a printer at that at Walmart, but I could be wrong. Any comments on this particular item? I was surprised to accidentally come across it. I didn't know such a thing existed.
Well, it's just a driver, correct?
No, this is a piece of software, a front end with a driver.
Okay.
And you have to, what you have to do is you have to check out what printers are supported with the product. If
Yeah,
you've got a printer,
on a previous screen you showed, it said Brother and Epson and HP, I think.
there was quite a few, and they probably add printers from time to time as well. So they may have started off with, say, half a dozen printers by various manufacturers, and they keep adding more and more because a lot of code is available that all they have to do is marry that code into their front end and driver to be able to accommodate more and more printer types. But I don't think probably the majority of us do enough printing to justify any costs that may be associated with it.
They have pricing, and it's in euros, and it is 80 euros for the more basic package. They may have a little bit. They may have a slightly more affordable one for 49 euros.
Well,
But
I wonder
anyway.
what makes it so exceptional to be worth
It
that.
looks like it's a color matching type software, whereas if you're doing graphics and stuff along those lines, where you actually tune your monitor to the right color palette, it would then tune the printer to that same color palette. That's what I'm guessing it is.
That could be. To be
Because
honest, I'm not interested
printing.
in this particular product because, like I said, I don't do enough printing as is. I only print what I need to when I need to, and I couldn't justify this item. But people who do taxes and some other things, and especially businesses, probably can benefit from it. But I thought I'd bring it up because I had never heard of anything like this before, and thought it quite novel, just like that air cooler.
It also seems to be able to handle unusual paper sizes.
Well, being that it's European made, that doesn't surprise me. They use a lot of different sizes of paper that we normally would not touch. We use a standard letter, legal size, and some large things for special printouts. But aside from that, usually in Europe, you got maybe 8, 10, 12 different paper sizes, like an A6, A9, and whatever sizes those happen to be. Okay.
Okay.
Now, I thought I'd bring this up because I'll be looking at this. I'm not sure exactly when I'll get to it, but I mean, I can tear this machine with Open Media Vault apart right now and try and play with this. But whether I'll do that or not over the Christmas holiday and New Year's holiday, I don't know yet. I haven't decided what I'm going to do. But what it does bring up is there's another one I didn't know about called Nextcloud. But the Casa OS sounds like it is more uh, capable, more functional than Nextcloud is. And the downside, as I see it, that I was mentioning earlier, is the fact that it's not an ISO image. You have to install a Linux OS, preferably a minimalized version or a server version, go into a terminal in that installation on that machine to execute an instruction. Actually, it's a set of instructions. They're not in this one here. I have a copy of what they are. Basically, you got to, in most Linuxes, you have to first install the package curl, and then you have a curl command line that will download from an HTTPS site all the Casa OS and install it on top of or along with whatever Linux distro OS you put on the system in the first place. And one other article that I had suggested something like Debian uh, desktop version minimalist. And the minimalist has absolutely no applications to it. They expect you to install your own apps that you want. And there are a lot of people that look at getting the minimalist systems and then customize them to what they want instead of getting a general desktop, removing all the stuff they don't want, and then putting in the stuff they do want. So that's a different approach. But that's still, it sounds like it's I've had a number of videos where they're kind of pushing this. But Hex OS takes the idea of Casa OS further, even though it's going to cost money, but it sounds like it'll have an iOS image. So you don't have to go through installing this intermediate Linux OS first and then install curl plus the Casa OS along with it or on top of it. I don't know which it does right at the moment. But in either case, it would still give you what you need, but it's not for everybody to set up that way, whereas Hex OS would be. I know you can get ISOs for TrueNAS, Unraid, and Proxmox, but those three are higher end versions, more for businesses and professional people, not people at home necessarily, but it can. Bob Baxter is still moving into his new house, so he's not here and hasn't been for a while. He and his group do have a Proxmox server, but they were also overwhelmed by how many options and things you got to learn about and know compared to like Open Media Vault. It's not as much. And So he had to find somebody who knew how to properly configure a Proxmox server and got it done. And they've been using it since then, again, as a remote server for those that are part of that project. So that's another reason for some to create such a project. Home servers are good for do-it-yourselfers, people who have technical skills like I've got to some extent. Peter probably has similar ones, but I'm not sure about Drew. I don't know about most of the rest of you, but you probably don't have as much technical background to handle both hardware and a piece of software that is very high end. Proxmox is a very high end, very respected product. Unraid is too, but it costs money. And TrueNAS is a respected high end product that is a tad easier, but it's more difficult than this open media vault that I showed you that I created. Anybody got any comments on it?
Open Media Vault is sounding better all the time.
Well, that's why last month when I breached the subject, I wanted stuff that was as simple as possible and still show you much of the high-end stuff that is available. Now, if I wanted to, and I had the money too, I would probably build a Proxmox myself. Okay? I wouldn't expect most of the rest of you to touch that with a 10-foot pole. But it can give you a very high-end server system that can do lots of things. There's a lot of people, Sanford Kolonik, as an example. He has over 10,000 pictures. Well, guess what? I found a piece of software that's made for Linux that gives him what he's been looking for a long time. And that's to be able to organize his photos, put on tags and other things like that, and turn a large mess that's disorganized into an organized possible mess. He also has a lot of movies that he watches on his TVs at home. I don't know about music as far as that goes. And he probably has still his former print business's records stored out on what is right now a Windows 7 media server. That got discontinued before Windows 8 came out and is not supported. So at the moment, he either has to build or buy a NAS or a server and transfer, learn it first, then transfer all that stuff from an old machine, etc. Now, the one thing that I want to also emphasize is in these type of machines, you can use Intel's new N95, 97, and N100 base systems, Celeron base systems, and Pentium, i3, i5. You could use i7 and i9, but for most of this easy stuff, you don't need even the i5 that I've got right now. An i3 or a Pentium would probably be just enough, but you have also options in the CPUs and the equipment you use, either 2-core or 4-core. I would go for the 4-core whenever possible versus a 2-core. Anything you want to discuss on that at the moment? Otherwise, I'm going to get on to Earl's thing. So I got a mouse that wants to travel. All right. I'm going to put that down. I'm going to see if I can get this to load up. And I hope you can reasonably read it. You'll get we'll give you a copy of this so you don't have to write anything down. Basically, he said the default way of accessing BIOS, etc., via continuously hitting an F key or delete key or escape key or whatever while a reboot is in progress is a real pain in the butt. And for some people, I know of other people who have had the same kind of a problem that I've tried to help remotely. So I understand where he's coming from. So consequently, I made a BIOS menu alias. And I mentioned I know aliases back in the first probably 6 versions of the Linux SIG I had created. But we never went any further with it. Here's an example of an alias that can give you a function. So the next line is you open up a terminal, you do an echo, double quote, alias, name of BIOS menu, equal, single quote, system control, reboot, double hyphen, firmware, close quotes. And then the 2 greater than signs means to send what it does to a file called .bashrc. It goes in your standard user account on the home directory, but you it's usually a hidden file. I unhid mine so I could see it. There is a batch RC that's in almost every Linux system. It's, shall we say, the foundation. These are various commands that allows the system, when you're in a terminal, to know what the command is, what its parameters are, and be able to execute it. Then when you're done with that, I want to add a proviso. The one thing I don't know for sure, because I didn't check it out soon enough, about where it makes the period bash rc file. I don't know if I need a sudo, so I did it without, just the way it's typed there, and then I did it again with a sudo space in front of it. That way I know it did get created. Now you're back at a command line again, and I'm going to kill this mouse one way or another. Gee, Christmas. But generally speaking, all you do is type in BIOS menu, hit enter, and it will reboot your computer and come up with your BIOS menu. Now, I'm positive, no, well, I'll take that back. Earl took and has had a Dell SFF machine, similar to ones I've got, a newer model though, and he also has a small HP Mini like I have and that I am using for Open Media Vault right now. It will bring up the the BIOS menu, main menu. The first entry is continue on booting like normal, or it gives you a whole list of other options, and one of them is a boot menu, which lists your devices that it can boot from, whether they're UEFI or possibly legacy. In some cases, it depends upon a BIOS setting as to whether you get only UEFI, you only get legacy, or in some cases, you get both. And then you select the device you want to boot from, and that's what happens. It boots up off of that device. So this is a way of a working system. All he's got to do is open a terminal, type in BIOS menu. It'll do all the rest for him until he gets to the BIOS menu. He can do what he wants to. He can make any kind of changes to the BIOS he wants. Then go ahead and boot up to the live system again. It works on his system. Again, I think he did this on the HP. I don't know, and he'd have to tell us if he tried this out on the Dell and if it worked there.
I'll tell you. When I did this research concerning the system control reboot firmware command, it did say that it won't necessarily work on every Linux system. And as you said, it works on my newer HP, but no, it does not work on my older Dell.
Okay.
It just, and the Dell, it looks like it's going to work. I mean, the screen goes blank and, you get the gears from the KDE Deons saying that it's rebooting, but it never completes. It somehow crashes and you're just hung.
Okay. Well, maybe somebody else can find out what modification is needed.
Yeah, but yeah, on my Dell, I'd have to use the F key method, but at least on the newer HP, I think I would prefer this message because, man, how many times have I hit all those keys and I miss it anyway? I don't know how, what happens. But this works, so that's fun. In fact, this whole area of using aliases to be shortcuts to regular terminal commands is very useful, as you indicated.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a whole bunch of them. If you, at the terminal, if you just type alias, it'll list all the aliases you have. For example, in that clip you have there, the first one is this alias alert. And of course, I've never even used it. I didn't even know I had it, but there it is. And there's a bunch of other ones there too. But by using this, you append on one more. And if it's useful, fine.
Bob Primick?
Yeah. First of all, yes, this is a very interesting thing that you've come up with. Second, Grub itself has, on almost every computer, an option way down at the bottom of the Grub menu that puts you into your firmware, especially if it's UEFI, but even legacy. It'll get you into your BIOS. And you can set the Grub menu not to time out so that it'll linger long enough you can look at it and scroll down at your leisure. On almost all systems, that option will function, but not on every system.
Well, I can tell you on Earl's system, he doesn't get a Grub menu. It's kind of hidden. There are ways of making it visible on a regular basis. That's an individual choice.
You may need to unhide the Grub menu.
Right. The other thing that I want to bring up with this little sucker here, let me, oops.
And I would like to put in a plug for Grub Customizer, which will allow you to invoke various options of how the menu will display, how long it will linger, and whether or not you'll see it.
Okay, now I mentioned in the past I found some interesting things this year earlier, and I made automatic launches so that I can see CPU power, sandbox Chromium browser when I use it, enlarge or reset text size. And I tried taking this basic command here and see if I could figure out a way of creating a desktop icon I could just click on and have it do the same exact function without having to open up a terminal and without having to type in BIOS menu and hit the enter key. I played with that for several hours this afternoon, and I didn't have any luck in that. So if anybody comes up with how to get that achieved, I'd like to know.
Well, let me comment that, all modern Linuxes use this thing called System D, System Daemon, which has all these controls like PACTL for pulse audio or system control, and there's many other controls too. And so the way I look at it, why not use it? It's a very, very nice system, and it's won over the hearts and minds of Unix people or Linux people, even though if you remember several years ago, the guy that came up with this System D, Pottering, I think his name is, man, the hate dumped on that man. You wouldn't believe that he was violating the true meaning of Unix and all of this nonsense. But it's so good and so useful in comparison to the other init systems that it's used everywhere now. I think there's only a couple Linux distributions that don't use System D by default nowadays.
That could be
System D was found to have a lot of extra code, and it requires many, many more lines of code to do anything. There are also some Linux and Unix features that are broken by System D
Well,
and have not yet been fixed.
uh,
well.
those other init systems are procedural. You use bash scripts or something, do this, do this, do this.
Yep.
And of course, there's a lot of ways to do anything in particular.
Right.
Whereas System D, you indicate as an administrator what you want done, what I want done, not how to do it. And consequently, for if you're administering, say, a server farms or something, it's the way to go, and it is the way to go today. The argument.
System D did overcome some issues. I think they had to do with the timing of various things. There was some
One of the
context.
goals was that the boot time would be less because it was doing things more in parallel. But,
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, it's over. And all these people who went hysterical about this System Daemon.
Hey, Earl, when it comes to that vitriolity, I go back starting my curiosity and trying to do some things with Linux back to 95 when I went to a computer show. And for somewhere between 5 and 8 years, anybody like myself at that time, and I still was a tech at that time, and ex-programmer analyst, if you ask the questions you need answers to get past a problem, you got flamed all the time
Oh, yeah.
by the old timers that already know it. And that,
WAFM.
but at the same time, over the years since then, that has very, very much disappeared. It's not gone, but there's much less of it and more people willing to help, especially beginners and novices, with their Linux questions, because not everybody knows everything. That's
Well,
impossible.
exactly. And I know exactly how that attitude arose because it came out of the Unix people at Bell Labs, and I worked there at the time. And Bell Labs had a culture. Let's say you were a new hire, and here's your office or whatever. Nothing was installed. You were left on your own. And the whole point is, if you're good enough to be at Bell Labs, figure it out, you know. They tell you what the men's room is, but that's about it. And and you were expected to do some homework, you know, read the fucking manual is what they
I know.
said.
I remember the acronym. But
Yeah,
anyway,
and
but those manuals, if you go into a terminal and you key in the word man space,
yeah,
and then
yeah,
you put in a command like curl, and you
yeah.
look at just the man pages for curl and try
Oh,
and figure out how would you construct a curl instruction. Good luck.
yeah. But I'm telling you, that was their attitude. You figure it out, and that spilled out. I do think it's a silly attitude because if you want something to be popular, you're going to have to make it easy for them. They're not going to struggle. If
Yep.
you're a new hire at Bell Labs, maybe you're going to struggle. But the average guy isn't going to struggle too much. He'll give up, do something else.
No, I agree. But
Anyway,
this,
System D, every Linux system today should have System D up and running. It should have Wayland up and running. It should have pipeline.
No, Wayland does not work with some things.
Well, with some things, but I can't. If
There's
you
a
a
lot that
guy like
doesn't
me
work
at
with
home,
Wayland. There's a lot that doesn't work with Wayland.
well, I've used it for years and I haven't bumped into anything.
I have.
I have in the past, but right now, mine's on Wayland right now, the desktop you're seeing,
Yeah.
in MIT 22, and also it was working in MIT 21, all subversions. So it depends upon the hardware, especially the graphics portion of your hardware. And in some cases, it doesn't work. And they haven't figured out a way around those instances. And some of this stuff sometimes takes years to figure out because
Yeah,
of the wide variety of hardware all of us have.
we're about 12 years into the Wayland era, believe it or not.
Well, Open Media Vault goes back to 2011, and I had no clue. I only found out about Open Media Vault in, I think, August of this year.
But you know, back when Wayland was first discussed, and people screaming, "Oh, the protocol is so broken, you can't even get a screen capture."
You can't, and you
Oh
also cannot
man,
do good. You also cannot do good desktop integration with certain types of software.
I tell you, this screen capture tool called Spectacle that I have on my machine running under Wayland is absolutely fantastic.
It's great when it works, but there are times when it doesn't.
Well, maybe I'm just lucky.
Well,
And
not
also,
necessarily, Earl, because like your alias command, it's good. It's the first. You're the first person to bring up alias commands since I originally did it about 2.5 years ago. Brought it up at a meeting, And bottom line is, it has useful features, but unless you can think of some ways of using that same feature, it's useless.
Now,
So now you've got a working version that works on some hardware. Maybe others who have different hardware might be able to figure out how to modify it so that the same thing works on other hardware like your Dell Optiplex.
they everything on these two computers, Wayland, Pipewire, System D, and all that works, and that suits me fine.
That's fine. It's just I'm saying, generally speaking, this was a topic I breached just like last month's NAS and server presentation that I did, as brief as it was. But it's a case where it's not for everybody. Aliases, you have to give people some ideas of how and where you would use them. And yours is the first one. I haven't thought of aliases in
Yeah.
over 2 years.
And
And
that's because today people like these graphical interfaces. They don't like a terminal. But
well,
I'm old enough, and when I worked for Bell Labs, and I was running Unix without any graphical interface, just from a command line prompt. That's all there was.
Well, I mean, I use Terminal, but I also use it on Windows. How many people in Windows use the Terminal?
And these people who are hysterical, oh my God, it's so hard to terminal. Oh God, you commit
I know,
suicide.
but I mean,
What the hell?
these
Get a grip.
launchers that I have here could probably be turned into aliases that you could
Yeah.
execute them from the
No.
terminal also.
And I think there is a way to somehow package up a bash script that would like this alias stuff and get an icon on your desktop. Maybe I'll think about that, but I think there's a way to do that.
I'm just saying, in general, Matt, this opens up a new area that really needs to be explored. I'll probably be playing with it some myself, Nat, because I want to see if I can take these four and make an alias for them. Because right now, if I open up a terminal, I have to have this area of the desktop to be able to execute these launchers to do those things, whereas I might be able to use them as a command like the BIOS menu that you made with an alias.
Things like from the terminal HTOP, or better yet, BPY top, which is a Python-based top, and it shows you everything about your computer. Now, you say CPU power. Do you mean temperature? You see your
Whoops, wait a minute.
icon in the upper left.
I got
It
the
says,
wrong thing here. I'm on the wrong. Again, I got multiple computers in front of me, multiple keyboards and mice, and a lot of
Okay,
times I
what do you
don't
mean
think.
by CPU power? The frequency?
That's it right there.
Okay. That's
This is
somehow
this
you're
is
set.
what this gives you here is the ability of your cores in your
Yeah.
CPU, and I can modify the minimum frequency and maximum frequency.
That's
Right
interesting.
now, I only did the maximum. I didn't do the minimum. I at one point did want to change this to 1.1 gigahertz, which would be 1100, and that way my system, when it's idling, would be possibly a little quicker getting up ramped up, because it would start out at 1100 instead of 800. So that's what one of these was here. This one here creates a sandbox so that when you're running a Chromium browser, the one down here, it would be sandboxed. Most of the browsers we use already have a sandbox feature, which helps protect your system from undesirable things happening that used to be before sandboxing became prevalent. These two here would be more prevalent in a terminal, because one of them will increase the size of text and the other one resets it to normal. So when I did double click that one, see how much bigger the text became. That's changeable by you individually. And then I double click this one here and it goes back to normal.
What do you think of Pipewire? It's just becoming standard in distros nowadays.
Well, once again, Pipewire, when it works, it's great, but it does not work with
And
most
my
audio drivers.
screen, oh
It
my
does not
God,
work.
my
I have
audio
been
video is
struggling for
gorgeous.
months. Could you please listen instead of yakking? I have struggled for months trying to get Pipewire to work with my audio drivers on my standard Intel hardware, and it just isn't working.
Well, here's one other thing that I want to mention too. When you are on your Linux, you change to LMDE, which is Debian based, versus regular Mint, which is based on Ubuntu, more or less. And so you can have different experiences just from that little difference.
I actually, right now, I'm in Linux Mint Cinnamon.
Okay.
Wilma. I'm in Wilma.
Okay.
And the audio still does not work properly. It does not properly detect what hardware I have, and it's really bad in my Intel NUC. On this tower, I'm barely able to actually override Pipewire. I force it to use pulse audio and use the pulse audio controls, which also don't work very well. They just simply do not find the drivers, and they do not find the firmware. And I've had trouble with this with all Linux that I have tried: Ubuntu, Mint, Debian, all the Debian family. I haven't really tried Fedora. Fedora does work better with Pipewire generally than the Debian family. But no, Pipewire is not ready for prime time. And by the way, Wayland, depending on the hardware you've got, is also not ready for prime time. Yes, they've been working on it for 15 years, but they haven't got it right.
I think the distros are making it the default, as far as I know.
They are, and there are problems that are resulting from this.
Well, I'm sure they'll get feedback if that's the case.
There has been a lot of feedback, and there's been a lot of effort going into trying to make these things work. Sooner or later, probably Wayland and Pipewire will get to a point where they will work with almost everything, but not at the present time. And by the way, when I say with Wayland desktop integration, if you're using the GNOME desktop environment, which is very common, you can't even create certain kinds of desktop shortcuts any longer, because GNOME has decided it's insecure to launch binaries from the desktop. Period.
Well,
And that is a real problem.
Yeah, I use KDE Plasma.
Yeah, that's a little more forgiving.
Yeah,
It
well,
must be.
I'm on the Cinnamon along with you right now, Bob, and I know Dennis is too.
Yeah.
Peter probably is. I'm not sure about Drew. And it all depends upon. You got to remember, even with like UEFI and a whole bunch of other things, Microsoft puts out a report to all manufacturers what they expect as the standard. Yet you have manufacturers of whole computers and subcomponents in those computers where they try and shave corners. They don't like this, let's do it this way, and so forth. And I don't know of any way of getting around that problem short of doing like Apple did. Make your own fabrication, make your own CPUs, GPUs, NPUs, whatever. Other than that, if you got to rely upon others to create this stuff and integrate it into a whole system, that's a problem. You got to live with what you can get and how well the individual operating systems and application programs will work with that hardware.
Well, any vendor who's making a machine that they're going to sell to the general public had better listen to Microsoft's
Oh yeah?
stipulations.
Would you
I mean,
like
they
to?
won't sell.
Would
They
you like?
generally do.
I-
And Intel plays nicely with Microsoft, but as I was remarking before the meeting, there are things like the Intel studio effects that were part of their ARC software, which they no longer include with the ARC software because Windows 11, if you upgrade to the 24H2, and if they've rolled it out to your version of 24H2, the studio effects have migrated over there, and they're actually better now, and their AI, they've got AI helpers, and they work across all kinds of applications, not just a few.
Okay,
But yeah, in Linux, the same sorts of things can happen.
but here's the thing. Only in recent years have companies sprung up. They're still fairly small, creating Linux only from the beginning. The hardware that they put together and make sure that at least it works with the version of OS they provide. But at the same time, too, there are some things that I know for those of you who may have known him, Jerry Sass. He was West Side director at the board, and he liked Lenovo computers quite a bit. There's a whole bunch of things that Lenovo won't support that I can do on other equipment. And that includes Microsoft Windows. So you cannot say a blanket statement. Now, most of them will cover most of Windows. Why? Because it's the biggest friggin' market out there.
Absolutely.
And if you want to stay in business, both as a hardware manufacturer and sell your goods, then you're going to have a high compliance. Yes. 100%? No. Guarantee it. And even on Linux, UEFI, I've tried 3 different versions so far, and 3 different versions have slight variations on how to set up UEFI. That's why it's a bear of a topic to try and deal with. And when it comes to your original problem from last month, it has to do with the size of it. Well, the megabytes that it's consuming on your machine right now is a drop in a bucket. Now, if you go back 25, 30 years like I do on the PCs, that's a big deal. But on these machines these days, forget it. It is a drop in a bucket. And I found no way of getting around it, because when I tried to create my own custom size UEFI on some Linux distros, it's when I went to go to do the install, they said, the UEFI's got to be the following size, period.
Yeah,
So
that's
then you
right.
got to redo every bit of your work for installation to make the UEFI the size they want.
By the way, that is not the OS making that determination.
No, it's the BIOS.
It is the BIOS.
Yes.
A BIOS, when you first boot, can only recognize FAT16, FAT32, or VFAT. Those are the only ones. There are some BIOSes for Apple that will recognize HFS Plus. Those are the only ones recognized by a BIOS. And that's hard coded into the BIOS. So if you want to write your own firmware for your BIOS and flash it over, you can change that. But otherwise, you're stuck with it.
Yeah.
And FAT32 has a minimum size. That partition has to be 256 megabytes because of the way the file system is structured.
Well, in some systems, I can go down as low as 100 megabytes.
That might be FAT16.
No, it says FAT32. I
Okay.
told it format
Well,
FAT32.
Again, maybe there's a BIOS. Maybe there are BIOSes that can handle it that way. But what all the online places I've seen have said about FAT32 is that it does have that minimum size.
And they may have done that in more recent years, and maybe the ones I can get away with murder on are older ones that don't have as big a demand on it. I don't
Or
know.
maybe, or are they legacy boot or are they EFI?
EFI.
Okay, because legacy boot doesn't have
No.
such restrictions.
I do have old legacy machines that don't know what UEFI is. It'll ignore it.
Yeah. The other thing about your EFI boot partition, not very much stuff should go there because anything you're doing, including customizing the grub background, if you ever do that, or the grub menu, that isn't. That's at a later stage in booting when you're already into your boot partition or your boot directory of your root file system. And that's formatted X or whatever you're doing, maybe Btrfs. And there you can put things like theming and fonts and various customizations, grub environment, etc. But that's where it's going to be looking for any customizations.
Well, I know of two other things that can be a cause for a larger EFI partition. One of them is if you do multi-boot on the same drive. That will require that. And I did have one system that until it died with up to 13 operating systems. So you had to have a pretty good size EFI partition on that.
Right. Even multi-boot when you use different drives, if you use Grub, you're going to have your various bootloaders in that EFI partition, and you'll have secure boot shims.
The other thing I know that can go into the EFI, at least it used to be able to, I don't know if it still is allowed, and it's probably not on all distros, is the kernel. You can put the kernel in there.
You can, but there's not that much advantage to it unless you've got a really slow booting system.
Well, that's probably when it was originally figured out and allowed for, is older, slower systems. And I got some of them that have EFI. They know what it is. And you might want to, especially if you have a Celeron Pentium or a maybe even an i3 in the system, you might want to have the kernel in the UEFI partition. But almost anything made in the last, I'd say, 5 years, it is superfluous because there is so very little advantage to it time-wise why bother? And it creates a headache in doing upgrades too.
Yeah, there is an initial RAM file system which does go in there.
My EFI partition uses 11 meg out of the 300.
Most systems do, especially when you only have one OS. It's usually below 100 megabytes, even if it demands you set up a 500 megabyte partition. And that's not a joke, Earl. It's a crazy thing. And right now, out of the two things I brought up, multi-booting and having the kernel in the EFI partition, and Bob brought up about a RAM drive that might also be set up in the EFI. There's no need for much more than probably 100 megabyte to at maybe 150.
But in any event, the size is determined by the BIOS.
Okay, I have just so everybody knows, I put the downloads of the articles and also that one slideshow in the chat box. So you can go to the chat box and download them.
Tim, did you try to change the format of that EFI partition to ext4 just for the fun of it?
Yep.
Did it work?
Nope.
Well, then the BIOS must be stipulating it then.
Most likely yes.
That is exactly what everybody says online.
And that's because of Microsoft. Microsoft was the first to push it. Microsoft says, okay, you got it. Now, maybe in the early days they didn't stipulate a size, but in more recent times, they apparently are in some BIOS saying you got to have this minimum size or else.
Yeah, it's not that you can't make it any different or any different format. It just won't work.
Well, you could probably make it bigger, but I don't think you can make it smaller.
Yeah, you can make it bigger, but there's not much point for the reasons I said. Not much that you could put in there is actually very functional, because when you get to about the second stage of boot up, you're going to be into your root file system or your boot partition.
But I mean, even, see, I've got Dell Optiplex 3010 and a 3020 SSF, similar to both Dennis's and Earl's 3050, and they all know UEFI. The ones on my two are much smaller UEFIs. Check out Earl and Dennis if you want to. What your UEFI partition size is on the Optiplexes. It'll probably be smaller than what Earl and I have currently on our HP minis.
Well, I think we made the partition 300 meg on both of those.
Right. But I mean, again, I first started making them smaller.
Yeah, and it did
and it
give
wouldn't
that
take
message. It has to be larger.
Yeah, it has to be at least the size it says it's got to be, or something bigger. And there's no reason to create it bigger, because most of the UEFI partitions have very, very little inside them.
Yeah, I happen to have an EFI boot partition on my tower that is 600 megabytes, and it's got 18 megabytes used.
Wow.
And on the other one, it's 260 megabytes, and it's got 47 megabytes used on the other internal SSD.
I don't doubt it. It's a crazy thing. I noticed exactly what Earl was complaining about even last month, before I put out his letter to the rest of you guys. And it's one of these cases where I can't see in almost, I'll say 98% probably of the cases out there of a computer where you need more than 100 megabytes set aside for it.
I think I did manually set these sizes so large, and I think it was because of how many bootloaders were going into them.
Well, see, with me and setting up Earl's and Dennis's, it was a case where if I try and make them smaller, a lot of the systems just say, hey, you got to the point where you want to install, but I'm not going to install it because the UEFI partition is the wrong size. This is what it should be. Therefore, I got to go back a screen and erase all the stuff that I set up and reset it up again so that the UEFI partition is the size it wants. And then when I get to the install part, I just hit install and it goes.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of that is the installer or whether it's actually reading what your BIOS is telling it.
It must be the BIOS. And early BIOS, like I said, like on the 30, 10, and 20, I don't think they got that limitation or it's much smaller. One of the two.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if they've been bumping this up over the years.
But I'd like to have a good reason why.
I can't give you a good reason.
I can't even think of a bad one right now. But aside from that, you got, yeah, it seems like a large chunk of space going to waste. But when you take the overall size of drives, most systems, unless they're used ones that you're buying like off of eBay and other places like that, are terabyte drives. A terabyte's 1,000 gigabytes, or a million. Not a million. 100,000 megabytes. So 500 megabytes out of 100,000 is a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, then you get into whether or not they're taking into consideration things like cluster size and various other parameters.
Well, with FAT32, the usual one, it's because some of them, especially under Linux, you don't always see FAT16 or VFAT.
Right.
And so the end result is FAT32 seems to be the default as far as I can see.
In most cases, I would guess so.
And that's got a small footprint cluster size compared to some of the other ones like a FAT16. I don't know how big BFAT is. I never looked into it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Drew, by the way, are you awake? Hello, Drew.
While we're waiting for Drew to wake up, let me ask a couple questions. Earl's thing was kind of technical, and I just want to ask some things just so I kind of understand the basic. If I'm understanding Earl's whole alias thing, okay, you boot up your Linux computer, it comes up, you now go to the terminal command, and you put in Earl's command.
Well,
That causes, and I'm not sure which, it either causes the boot menu to come up on your screen, or the command is actually temporarily changing some settings in your boot menu.
No.
Was either of those?
When you bring up terminal in Linux, hang on a second here. Let me do something here. It's an important point that you're bringing up here. And
yeah, so are we talking about we're calling up an option that's already there, or are we creating something new?
Well, here's the terminal. This is usually all you see. Now, if you take Earl's thing, first try it with ECHO alias and then you get into a equal sign, a double quote, etc. I'm not going to type it all out because I don't remember all the exact verbiage. And then you hit the enter key. This creates a file that after the two greater than signs is called .bash rc. Now,
You already have.
just a minute. Now, when I go to home directory here and I scroll down, I have bash rc right here. So this file already exists. This has a modification date of today. That's when I did it. And if you then on the next
That contains
line,
Earl command right there, that file?
no,
That file contains Earl's
wait a minute.
command?
No, this is a file of commands terminal knows. And all you're doing is appending with that double greater than sign the echo command with alias to this file at the end of it. So it's a brand new command. Okay? And now if I'm going to hit the enter key here. Ignore any garbage here. Now you got a brand new line. I can key in BIOSMENU. Now I'm not going to hit enter because it's going to reboot my computer. That's exactly how it works. From now on, all you would key in, let's back this up here and go clear. Nuts. This mouse wants to travel in my lap. Okay, now you've already got the alias command appended to the .bash rc file called BIOS menu. So now you are up and running, but you want to go in, maybe because you are wanting to boot the computer off a different drive than the normal drive you boot up from, such as a flash drive that's bootable. So then you key in, instead of at the restart, tapping an F key, an escape key, or a delete key to get the boot menu to come up and select your device, you'd key in BIOS menu, that's all, hit enter. Everything you see on the screen right now goes away because it restarts the computer. And as soon as it gets to it, it will bring up your BIOS settings and you can make whatever changes you want, which includes what device do I want to boot from.
Okay.
Tim, another point that needs to be, you don't need to use alias. You could just type that system control command right at the prompt, and it'll work that one time. The only reason you appended the line into that .bash rc is so it'll be there after your next login and all of that.
Well,
hang on. If you want to create a desktop shortcut, a launcher, and you already have a command that can be executed through the terminal, it's very easy to create a launcher in Linux that'll do that.
I spent a couple hours and couldn't get it to do it. It kept the first time I tried to create a launcher, it said, "Sorry, I don't recognize BIOS menu." Then I tried extensions before and after that, and none of them worked because you can't find BIOS menu because it's a command within bash rc.
I see.
And
so
then,
you would need to create. You would need to create the command in such a way
that
it would be available as a binary.
I started playing with creating a script file, and I don't think I kept it. I'm not sure here.
I don't know how scripts handle aliases.
No, I didn't keep it. I basically speaking, it was something that I found in a search, and I tried a lot of variations. It's a way of creating a script to launch an application in a desktop available icon, just like the launcher is there. And I even changed the icon in it because it gave you a command how to do that. And basically speaking, it wouldn't work either. It kept saying there's one or more errors in my script. And you're playing around with all these different lines of stuff. You're only talking about maybe 6 to 8 lines. And nothing I tried would ever launch that script file correctly, even though I had an icon on the desktop for that script.
Tim, did you put the first line in the script file that has to be in all script files? I can't remember it right now.
Yeah, it's a pound exclamation point.
Like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exclamation point bin bash.
yeah. You have to put that in. That was in there, but there were other commands that mimic the launcher's script, because that's essentially what the launcher is doing. And it's taking your app and put it into a script that you can then launch from a desktop icon. But nothing I tried would work with this BIOS menu, at least not so far.
Try looking at the reference I just put into chat. It claims you can do this.
Oh, I'm sure there's a way of doing it. I just haven't found it yet. And
I just put something into chat that gives some instructions as to how you might be able to do it.
Okay. Well,
and underneath that, I just posted this little thing I found on the web right now about EFI BIOS requiring FAT32.
Has that been posted to everybody?
I don't see it, Earl.
To everyone.
Usually it defaults to everybody unless you specify a person.
Yeah, I don't see Earl's posting.
Yeah, it hasn't come up yet. Maybe try again.
What do I have to do to try again?
I just call up the chat box and put it into where you type the message. There it is. You got it.
Yeah, it just Earl's came up and Bob's is just above it.
Yeah. Well, I guess I needed to hit a return there that I didn't hit.
Yeah, you have to hit a return, or there's a little blue button with a greater than sign down in the bottom right corner, and you click on
it's a little
that.
paper airplane.
Okay. I'm not wearing my reading glasses, so I missed that. Well, anyway,
I missed hitting a button Tuesday and didn't get the meeting document.
Yeah.
You didn't hit the
so it happens to everybody.
If you hit the enter key, you would have gotten it.
Look at what it says. Yeah, it can boot from an ext4 partition, but only if it's formatted as a FAT32. Sounds like an oxymoron to me.
But in either case, like I said, I spent a couple hours trying umpteen different ways to make a stupid icon work on the desktop to launch the BIOS menu, instead of having to open up a terminal, then issue the command and hit enter. And it does it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, this has all led down a very interesting little rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's been a long day.
Well, and I'm hoping between Open Media Vault to get more of that set up. I want to get the automatic shutdown and relaunch. I want to check out this reduce the power consumed while it's running, and start setting up security stuff on it, etc., and see how that works out. I want to do some testing. If the idea works, I'll keep this and NVMe drive. I'll stick another one in the machine and start playing with the Casio OS and see what happens there.
Well, I do think that Open Media Vault sounds very interesting.
Oh, it does. And like I said, it goes back to 2011, and it surprised me. But everybody says version 6, don't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Well,
Because
I
things they changed caused it not to function well, and now it's on version 7. So I'm on version 7.4 something. And
YouTube videos up on it that I've watched.
oh, I've got what you got last month is next to nothing. You ought to see all the ones I've got, including some guides for novices, how to deal with it, do some of the settings and stuff like that. I haven't gotten enough time to get through all the stuff yet. So that's what I got to work on probably the next couple of weeks. And in the meantime, aside from that task, I want to try and at least see what the Casio O is before things start jumping again in January. And the next meeting, instead of being January 2nd, which is the first Thursday of the month, and I knew Sanford would not go with that, and quite often he just cancels the meeting, but I noticed we've got no meetings the first full week of January. So he'll hold a West Side meeting on January the 9th, and the following Tuesday will be his TNT SIG, and we go on from there.
By the way, let me just ask you, I do think that FAT32 has been either opened up by Microsoft or it has been reversed engineered in an open source sense.
Well, Microsoft created FAT32 way back when we used to have dinky little systems, and the largest size of a drive was 32 gigabytes. Anybody who tried to put a 40 gigabyte drive in their system could only see and use a 32 gig segment without taking the extra area and making a logical drive out of it.
Okay, so Microsoft basically said it's obsolete.
That's how, and they made the cluster size smaller. Well, actually, the cluster size is bigger than FAT16, the old setup, and the 32 has a smaller cluster size, but can only handle 32 gigabytes. And then you go on with bigger and bigger drives, and eventually they made NTFS because of the NTF4 operating system, which was used by people that didn't use 95, 98, 98 second edition, and the one other OS based on that model, because the other one is a basic business format. And that started off with NTFS version 4 in 3.52, I think it was. Then it became version 4, Windows NT. Then you went to 2000. Then you went to XP. And I can't remember for certain if it was during the XP 11-year reign or 14-year reign, I don't remember which it is, or if it was Vista that changed NTFS from 4 to 5. And 5 is a new version. They did a conversion of anybody who had NTFS 4 to NTFS 5 so they could continue forward.
But the point is, it's no longer Microsoft intellectual property.
Well, believe it or not, unless they've changed it, Microsoft is part of the Linux development
Yes, yeah.
group. So
Now,
they're part of that too. And there's a lot of things that are real old and out of date. They just said, hey, the heck with it. We just make them available to everybody.
sure. That makes sense to me.
Well, I mean, that's a way a lot of things go with proprietary software. Or a company goes out of business, and unless somebody buys up the business assets, which includes the code, and relaunches it, say as open source instead of closed proprietary source, then everybody can have at it. And you never know how it's going to work out. It's just like Linux. There's a lot of things that die in Linux. And then some of it, people come along, find it by some means, and say, hey, I think it's still a viable idea. And they take the code and they start playing with it on their own and revive the basic idea with newer software and ideas added to it. That's normal. Anybody got anything else?
No, I'm ready to go.
One thing that you guys might want to do, if you want the notes, is on chat. Double click that so it brings up the box on the right side of your screen, and up at the top you'll see 3 tiny dots on the right side. Click that and you can do a save of that information.
Okay.
All right.
I did that, Tim. It said save chat, so I hit it, but it didn't tell me where it saved it.
It always saves it to the same exact place all the time.
All right, I'll find
You
it.
go into Documents, you'll find a folder called Zoom, and in Zoom you will find entries. I don't know how many you'll see out there because it depends on how often you save things. As the host, it will do an automatic save for me.
Okay.
I don't have to save it.
It will be Documents, Zoom, today's date, and
Right.
the time at which it was last saved.
And usually that means it's the first entry, not the last entry.
And its title will be Meeting Saved New Chat Text.
Oh, okay, great.
And then all you got to do is double click it. It should open up in a text editor, and you can do what you want to with it.
Okay.
The only thing that might not show up are the graphic images.
And also be sure you separately download any meeting handouts that were posted.
Yeah, I did that.
Those are documents.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a way of file sharing that way.
Yeah.
But you can't do the same thing from the chat notes. In other words, you can't do another set of them. They don't exist.
Right.
They only exist in the chat while Zoom is running.
And then whoever hosts the meeting can download the chat from the meeting and save it if they wish, but we don't do that generally.
Well, I do as a host.
Oh,
And
okay.
I'm sure Sanford and Ed do too. It's an automatic thing.
So this is meeting hosts are saving it for their purposes as well. I know
It's
of
not
another
that
group where the
we
chat is
are
posted.
doing it. Zoom has always done it.
Yeah.
It's an automatic
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, it's automatic for the meeting host.
Yeah.
And I belong to another group or two where they host their chat downloads to their group website. But that's that one group has its own wiki site.
Yeah. It varies group to group. But if they just tell people, hey, go to the chat box, double click it, and then click on the three dots. And it keeps changing from time to time because there's been about 4 different ways this was done that I know of in Zoom. And this is the 4th one. And you save the chat. Each individual that's interested in it can get it. And in other groups, I save the chat if I think there's something of interest there.
Yeah. Well, anyway, as long as somebody saves it.
All right. And I'll assume Drew fell asleep, so that's okay. I'll send him the stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Everybody have a good night. Have a good Christmas and New Year's or Hanukkah, whichever the case may be, or Kwanzaa. That's another one too. Ho, 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 ho. Have a hairy Merry Christmas and a hairy New Year.
Happy holidays.
All right. See you guys later.
You later.